Speaking of the origins of the US-Soviet Cold War, we must trace it back to the time of World War II. Both the United States and the Soviet Union emerged as new great powers during the war. During World War II, faced with the common threat of fascist aggression, the US and the Soviet Union established a cooperation that transcended social systems and ideologies. But as the war neared its end, disagreements began to surface over how to build the post-war order and divide national interests. Conflicts between the two powers started to emerge. During the Great Patriotic War, the Soviet Union lost nearly 27 million people and about 1/4 of its national wealth. To avoid repeating the tragedy of invasion, the Soviet Union, after the war, placed great emphasis on building its security buffer. Therefore, the Eastern European countries liberated by the Red Army fell under Soviet influence and took the socialist path, becoming satellite states of the Soviet Union. While consolidating national security, Stalin did not abandon the idea of peaceful coexistence with the United States. In Stalin's view, although economic and ideological systems differed, the coexistence of these systems and the peaceful settlement of US-Soviet disputes were not only possible, but also necessary for the sake of global peace. However, world developments rarely follow ideals. The Soviet strategy for national security inevitably clashed with America's strategy for global dominance. US politicians regarded the Soviet Union and the spread of socialism as a terrifying menace. They were deeply fearful and anxious about the wave of socialist revolutions sweeping across the world at the time. In the early post-war years, European countries were gravely weakened by wartime destruction. British hegemony collapsed. In this historic moment, the United States took the initiative to assume leadership over Europe. At that time, the US economy and military power were far ahead of others. In addition, the United States was the only country that possessed the atomic bomb. These factors combined to push the US toward adopting a hardline policy against the Soviet Union. On March 5, 1946, the Iron Curtain speech became the first instance after World War II where a Western leader publicly voiced opposition to the Soviet Union. This speech was carefully orchestrated by US President Truman, delivered through the mouth of Britain, to express views the US itself could not openly declare. It laid the groundwork for the later Truman Doctrine. A year later, revolutions broke out in Greece and Turkey. Guerrillas led by local communist parties were on the verge of taking power. The US Congress held an emergency meeting to discuss the situation. After World War II, Europe's economy was devastated, unemployment soared, and workers' movements erupted one after another. The communist parties of Western Europe grew rapidly in strength. In less than 10 years, the number of Communist Party members in Western European countries increased from 500,000 in 1939 to 4 million by 1947. Truman believed that if the Greek government were taken over by communists, it would trigger a chain reaction affecting Turkey and even the entire Middle East. The consequences would extend far beyond the East and impact the West as well. Under such pressure, the United States decided to make its stance clear. On March 12, 1947, Truman delivered a speech before Congress, declaring the containment of communism as the guiding principle of American political ideology and foreign policy. This principle became known as the Truman Doctrine. Under its guidance, the US provided funds and weapons to arm the Greek government forces, eventually crushing the People's Revolution in Greece. During the Cold War, the Truman Doctrine remained the cornerstone of US foreign policy. But in essence, it represented interference in other countries' internal affairs. Under the guise of being the protector of the free world, the US intervened at will in foreign nations. Any factor unfavorable to Western society was one-sidedly viewed as communist agitation rather than as a flaw within capitalism itself. This was precisely the deeper influence of the Truman Doctrine. Its effects went far beyond policy. The introduction of the Truman Doctrine marked the beginning of the Cold War between the capitalist camp, led by the United States, and the socialist camp led by the Soviet Union. To complement the Truman Doctrine in the economic field, The US introduced the Marshall Plan in 1947, also known as the European Recovery Program. Between 1948 and 1952, over 4 years, Western European countries received US aid in various forms, including financial and technical support, totaling about $13 billion. Of this, 90% was grants and 10% was loans, essentially free money. Why was the US so generous? Was America simply being benevolent? Of course not. On one hand, through the Marshall Plan, the US could naturally dominate Europe's political and economic structure, making Western Europe economically dependent on the US. On the other hand, after the war, the US faced massive overproduction. The Marshall Plan allowed the US to export its surplus capacity to Europe, opening vast markets for American goods. Furthermore, since Europe was the Cold War front line, reviving Western Europe helped strengthen the capitalist bloc. The Marshall Plan was highly successful. The United States tightened its control over Western Europe. The countries of Western Europe also recovered from the ravages of war. With the assistance of the Marshall Plan, from 1948 to 1952, Europe experienced the fastest economic growth in its history. Industrial output grew by 35%. By the time the Marshall Plan ended, Western Europe's economy had returned to pre-war levels and embarked on 2 decades of rapid growth. During this period, the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan were concrete expressions of the U.S. strategy for global dominance in politics and economics. And they established the basic orientation of U.S. foreign policy for over 40 post-war years. In the same period, the Soviet Union also consolidated political forces in Eastern Europe and, through the Molotov Plan, strengthened its control over Eastern Europe in political and economic spheres. Differences in social systems and ideology made the United States and the Soviet Union inevitably drift toward confrontation. Their first showdown was the First Berlin Crisis of 1948. Defeated Germany was the vanquished power of World War II. After the war, the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, and France took over Germany by dividing it into occupation zones. Berlin, the capital, lay within the Soviet occupation zone and was likewise divided among the 4 powers. This special geopolitical arrangement became the direct root of Berlin's frequent crises thereafter. On how to handle Germany, the US and USSR were sharp at US insistence. The American, British, and French zones were merged. In June, the Western occupation zones carried out currency reform and issued a new currency. This unilateral handling of the German question met with strong Soviet opposition. To pressure the Western countries and force them to stop forming a West German state, the Soviet Union decided to blockade Berlin, cutting off completely all water and land transport and freight between the Western zones and Berlin, leaving only 3 air corridors from the Western zones to Berlin. This became known as the First Berlin Crisis. Confronted with a Soviet blockade, the United States, relying on its powerful air force, launched a massive airlift, flying in food and daily necessities for 2.5 million West Berliners each day. At the same time, the West imposed a counter-blockade on coal, steel, electricity, and more. As the blockade dragged on, the economic cost of the U.S. airlift kept rising, while the counter-blockade prevented the USSR from obtaining the goods and industrial raw materials it needed from the Western zones. The United States and the Soviet Union had to return to the negotiating table. On May 12, 1949, the Soviet Union announced the lifting of the blockade, ending the nearly year-long First Berlin Crisis. The Berlin Crisis made both sides realize that they could not reach consensus on the German question, thus accelerating Germany's division. On September 20, 1949, the Federal Republic of Germany was founded. On October 7, 1949, the German Democratic Republic was established. Thus, the once unified Germany was split into 2 states with completely opposing political systems and ideologies. During the same period, both sides built their own military alliances. On April 4, 1949, the United States and Western European countries in Washington signed the North Atlantic Treaty. NATO, led by the United States, was established. On May 14, 1955, the Soviet Union and Eastern European countries in Warsaw signed the Warsaw Treaty, forming a military alliance to counter NATO. The creation of NATO and the Warsaw Pact signified the two blocs' Cold War-style military confrontation. The German question was the focal point of the clash between US and Soviet interests in Europe during the early Cold War. In 1958 and again in 1961, the Second and Third Berlin crises broke out, respectively. Because West Berlin lay within East German territory and continuously hosted US, British, and French garrisons, it was regarded by the Soviet Union and East Germany as a thorn planted by the Western world in the socialist camp. Western countries maintained numerous spy agencies and agents, secretly gathering Soviet intelligence in West Berlin. The most famous case was the Berlin Tunnel, built jointly by the US CIA and Britain's MI6, which tapped Soviet underground communication cables to intercept classified traffic. The tunnel housed around 600 devices, operating around the clock, and consumed over 800 reels of tape each day, yielding a vast trove of Soviet intelligence. The tunnel was exposed by the Soviet Union in 1956. For security reasons, the USSR demanded the withdrawal of US, British, and French troops from West Berlin, but this was rejected. Moreover, West Berlin's economy outperformed East Berlin's, prompting large numbers of East Germans to flee to the West, which caused a labor shortage in East Germany. Because of West Berlin's special status, it posed a direct threat to the GDR's political security, economic development, and social stability. Therefore, on August 15, 1961, the East German government began building the Berlin Wall along the East-West Berlin border to halt the movement of people between the two sides. Thus, the Berlin crisis ended in this way. The Berlin Wall, not only a symbol of the division between East and West Germany, but also of the division of Europe and the world, and the most iconic embodiment of Cold War confrontation. The above outlines the origins and intensification of the US-Soviet Cold War in Europe after World War II. Next, we turn our attention to Asia, on the other side of the globe.